Welcome, everyone. My name is Sue Harmon, and I'm a librarian at the Manchester City Library in Manchester, New Hampshire. Thank you for joining us today for part 3 of our Culturally Curious Art Series, Introduction to Frank Lloyd Wright and the New Hampshire Zimmerman's House. I'm joined by Jane Martinez from the Wadley Memorial Library. This program was made possible by the combined resources of our libraries and the New England College Libraries. And we're very excited to be able to offer educational programs to our patrons. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. All attendees are automatically muted to cut down on background noise. Jane will answer questions at the end of the program, so please use the chat box for questions as soon as you think of them. Make sure that the message is going to everyone. Any messages sent privately to me will not be read aloud, but feel free to send me a private message if you're having technical difficulties. This program is also being recorded. Some upcoming programs to let you know about. This month, the Manchester Library has 2 Franco-American programs that we're going to be hosting. On May 10th, that's next Tuesday, we will host a presentation by Robert B. Peralt about the Franco-Americans of Manchester. It's a hybrid program, so you can join via Zoom or you can come in person to the City Library, and we'll be holding that in the auditorium. Our second program on May 24th is a documentary screening of Waking Up French, followed by a community discussion. The program is in person. There's no hybrid component. There's no Zoom component. So we encourage you to sign up to reserve your seat. You can sign up by going to www.manchesterlibrary.org and clicking on upcoming events to view the calendar listings. And Jane, if you want to talk about your program.
Yes, so on June 23rd, the Wadley Memorial Library will be hosting Claire Evans and her program, From Uptown Girls to Downton Abbey, How American Gilded Age Heiresses Invaded the British Aristocracy. Registration is required for this program, so you can sign up by going to www.wadleylibrary.org and click on events to view our calendar listings and then register from there.
Thanks, Jane. All right, your feedback is also very important to us. I'm going to be putting a link to a survey in the chat window. Please follow that link at the end of the program to fill out a brief survey. Your responses really help us out. You can let us know what types of programs you'd like to see in the future. And if you give us your email, we'll sign you up for our newsletter for all of our upcoming programs and library news. And your presenter today is Jane O'Neill. She curates and delivers art appreciation programs to audiences throughout New England and beyond. Jane holds a master's in art history from Boston University and a master's in education from Harvard University. A New Hampshire native, she has worked at some of the state's most esteemed cultural institutions, including the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, where she serves as executive director, and the Currier Museum of Art, where she held the role of senior educator. Jane has also taught at the college level for more than a decade, most recently at Southern New Hampshire University. For more information, you can visit iamculturallycurious.com. And with that, I will hand it off to Jane. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Susan. And let me just start sharing my screen here. All right, we are in business. Thank you, everybody, for taking time out of your day to learn a little bit more about Frank Lloyd Wright and his designs in New Hampshire. I know we have participants coming in tonight from seemingly across the country, which is really exciting. And I think a lot of people perhaps from the greater Manchester area. So if you are familiar with the raise your hand function in Zoom, I would just love to see if you've been to the Frank Lloyd Wright House or in Manchester, or if you've been to any Frank Lloyd Wright design building in the past. Okay, so all right, this is really cool. Okay, so a few of us have been to a few Frank Lloyd Wright properties. This looks like this is really wonderful. Okay, so we are in for such a treat tonight because we're going to be learning about really a world-class artist and architect. And there's local connections here that are really exciting that we'll spend a lot of time exploring. So on the screen, of course, is Frank Lloyd Wright's best known design, the house called Falling Water that's in southwestern Pennsylvania. We'll talk a little bit about its connections to his designs in New Hampshire, but there's so much to cover tonight. So I wanted to just spend a moment to do a quick preamble here. As we're looking at two-dimensional images, there is an inherent challenge in just keeping people oriented with the three-dimensional spaces that we'll be moving through tonight. So along the way, I'm going to try and make it as clear as possible. We are looking at something here, and now the next image is as though we're turning to the right. And so if there ever is confusion around that, how we're moving through some of these spaces, we can backtrack to the namely provide any additional clarity, but I'm going to be really intentional in that. Now, the other thing that I just wanted to note really quickly is that the Frank Lloyd Wright designed Zimmerman house that we'll be looking at tonight is the site that is near and dear to my heart. I got really familiar with it when I was in college. 20 plus years ago, I interned there and I helped to catalog some of the Zimmerman's personal possessions. I helped to train the docents for a summer while I was there. And then just a few years after that, after I'd finished grad school, I came back to Manchester and I started running the tour program. And I had the absolute pleasure of working with the docents, the volunteer tour guides that lead the tours at the Frank Lloyd Wright designed Zimmerman House in Manchester. And let me tell you, they are some of the most dedicated volunteers you could ever imagine. They have committed themselves to the research, to the history, to the absolute facts and details of the house. And they held me to a very high standard. So because of these incredible volunteer docents at the Frank Lloyd Wright designed Zimmerman House, I ended up visiting, I think it was close to 36 different Frank Lloyd Wright designed properties over the course of my tenure at the Courier Museum. And that was just such a pleasure. And in all of that traveling, I have to say, the Zimmerman House stands out above almost all the rest of the Frank Lloyd Wright houses that I've visited in the way that it has been preserved, in the way that it tells the story of his work and the lives of the Zimmermans. So we'll be seeing all of that tonight. So let's get started with a quick introduction to Frank Lloyd Wright. We see him here in 4 different images from sort of spanning his life here. I'm going to give you just a really quick thumbnail sketch of the architect. He lived a really long and a really interesting life, but we're not here tonight necessarily to get familiar with him, more so his architecture. So it makes sense for us to know that he was born in 1867, just after the American Civil War. And then he dies in 1959, so just around the space age, really. So it's incredible to think about what a person sees in a life that's framed by those years. And during that time, he has this incredibly long and productive career, and he designed buildings that even today look distinctly modern. They are set apart from other buildings and structures in America. Now, he worked as an architect, he worked as a landscape architect, he worked as a furniture designer, an author, a teacher, and even occasionally as a fashion designer. We might be able to touch on that tonight too. He was a person with a really dramatic life story. He came from humble beginnings. He faced all kinds of obstacles. He had early success, kind of a fall from grace, and then he kind of reinvents himself. It's like the quintessential American success story. Now, when many people think of Frank Lloyd Wright, they think of a lot of the scandals that were associated with his very long life. He had a life that was marked by scandal, marked by tragedy. He famously left his wife for a client's wife. Later on in their life, they were attacked and there were multiple murders in one of his homes that was then later set on fire. So people are kind of drawn to this incredible life story of his. And despite all of these kind of personal and professional setbacks, he has this enduring legacy. He was, in fact, voted the greatest American architect of all time. And how wonderful is it that here in Manchester, New Hampshire, we have these 2 Wright sites that are open to the public. There's really not a lot of other places in the world where you can come and have an experience like this. So Frank Lloyd Wright is a person that really captured the American popular imagination. And no offense to his body of work, I fully respect it. But I think that part of the fascination with Frank Lloyd Wright is that it's sort of personality driven. He had a tremendous ego, and he would wear berets and he would wear capes, and he would say things like, I feel a strange disease coming on. It's called humility. So he is somebody that that kind of drew interest and attention to his life, to his work. So here we see him, the man, the myth. Here he is on the cover of Time magazine from 1938, and here he is featured in a postage stamp from 1966. On the left, he is featured in front of an image of falling water, which of course we'll spend a little bit of time with tonight. And then over here on the right, he is in front of the Guggenheim Museum, which we'll also get familiar with. So we've got sort of a sense of who he was. Now let's turn our attention to how we'll spend this next hour together, getting familiar with him and his work. We're going to start off with kind of understanding Chicago and Frank Lloyd Wright's early career, kind of setting the stage for what will come. Then we'll turn our attention to his masterworks, Falling Water and the Guggenheim, and the philosophies that are bound up in those works. And then we'll shift gears and focus on the fact that Frank Lloyd Wright had three primary different house design types during his career. I'll introduce you to those different types, how they differ from each other, and then we'll zero in on that last house design type called the Usonian house, and this wonderful example that we have here in Manchester, New Hampshire, called the Zimmerman house. And then surprise, there is that second house on the same street, the Khalil house. We'll get a little glimpse at it as well. And we'll wrap up with Wright's, with how he's really perceived today, what his legacy looks like. Incidentally, this little image over here on the right is just a little passage. It's part of a long hallway at the Zimmerman house, and it's his kind of modern take on a stained glass window. These are glass culls from Corning Glassware. These are pieces of colored glass that would have normally been thrown away, and he exhibits them set against this electric light behind them. And believe it or not, a lot of people walk right by this when they first visit the house. They kind of have to make a loop or two before they realize that this exquisite little installation is there, and it is absolutely beautiful. It's one of the most colorful places in the house. So let's turn our attention to Chicago. Let's start thinking about Wright's early years and his initiation into the world of architecture. So it's important to understand what's happening in Chicago, which is sort of roughly where Frank Lloyd Wright launches his career in the late 19th century. Now, Chicago in this era was really thought of a mecca for young, ambitious architects. And it has always been thought of as a place of opportunity and innovation when it comes to architecture. And that is because, in part, of the Great Chicago Fire, which happened in 1871. This is a Currier and Ives print that sort of gives us a sense of what that fire might have looked like. It displaced 100,000 people, and we can see them sort of making their way across this bridge away from this fire that ends up leveling 3 square miles of the city. This is what Chicago looked like after the Great Fire. It's pretty hard to imagine. Most of these structures were wooden structures. So you can imagine every young architect who wants to make a name for himself, wants to build something of distinction in a major city, is coming to Chicago because there is space to build, even though space is at a premium. So we think of Chicago as sort of the birthplace of the modern skyscraper. A lot of these architects were building straight up, but they were drawn to this area. And I think it's a particularly exciting time when you imagine that there are all these young people with innovative ideas kind of bumping into each other. And it wasn't just because of the fire, because about 2 decades later, you also have the World's Columbian Exhibition, also known as the World's Fair. This is the anniversary, the celebration of the anniversary of 400 years since Christopher Columbus discovered the New World. So there was a major celebration in the city of Chicago, and major architects from all around came together to build this temporary white city. Many of you are probably familiar with the story of this World's Fair because there's this fantastic book about it called Devil in the White City, which really is an incredible document, a resource in terms of the backstory, in terms of how this city was built. And it's all woven into a great true crime story too. So if you like that sort of thing, it's a real page turner. So what happened for this World's Columbian Exhibition is these great architects came together and built these massive temporary structures that made Chicago look like, ancient Greece, ancient Rome, these huge temples that were not meant to last longer than the World's Fair itself. And the World's Fair only lasted about 6 months. During those 6 months, 27 million people traveled to Chicago to see this breathtaking event. And this was an opportunity for America to really say, this is the best of what we can have to offer. There were not only architectural innovations, but really landscape architecture innovations as well. There were, man-made lagoons, as you can see here, these kind of gondola rides that went along with it. So Frank Lloyd Wright was still an up-and-coming architect during this time. He got to wander around the World's Fair. He saw the Great White City, and this wasn't really what necessarily had an impact on him, because this isn't really his this isn't his visual style. But we do know that he probably saw the Japanese pavilion while he was there. There were 46 different countries represented at this World's Fair. So it's very likely that he saw the Japanese style buildings that were built at this World's Fair. And there's something about these pavilions that probably sort of, burrowed a little hole into his brain, because he integrates so many of these elements into his architecture over the next several decades, actually really throughout his career. So these low sort of expansive eaves that provide a lot of shade. He's also known to create furniture that's very low to the ground, sort of in the same Japanese style. He never credits Japanese architecture as being a source for him. Instead, he credits Japanese prints, interestingly enough. But we think that this interaction that he might have had at the World's Fair certainly made an influence on him. Now, another huge influence is one other building at the World's Fair that was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright's mentor, a man by the name of Louis Sullivan. Sullivan designed the transportation building that we can see over here on the left. And there are some aspects of the transportation building that might look classical, sort of like the rest of that white city. We've got these rounded Roman arches repeated again and again in this massive structure. But there are other elements of it that are decidedly modern. This prominent kind of squared off cornice up above, and the repetition of that rounded Roman arch leading into this building. These are all sort of signature Louis Sullivan elements here, and we'll see that Frank Lloyd Wright integrates them into his work along the way. So Frank Lloyd Wright sets up shop, he settles down and sort of sets up shop just outside of Philadelphia in 1898. And so he gets married, he has 6 kids, and he builds this house in Oak Park, Illinois. Now, this is a suburb of Chicago that you can reach today via public transportation, and I highly recommend doing it. There's about 25 Wright design properties right in Oak Park, Illinois. And so you can just walk down the street and kind of pick them out very easily from their neighbors. So this is just part of the house. He added a studio that you can just barely see over here on the left. But this is a great sort of early indicator in terms of his preferences when it comes to architecture and design. So like I said, he had 6 kids. So the first room that I want to show you on the inside of his home here is the children's playroom, which is on the top floor here. Now, we have 2 views here. You can imagine when you're looking at the view on the left, you're roughly standing at the doorway over here. When you're looking at the view on the right, you're probably standing right in front of the fireplace. So this is what I would call a very elegant playroom. I mean, my kids are lucky if they get a little time in my basement, and Frank Lloyd Wright has created this beautiful barrel vaulted ceiling room. The ceiling is actually 15 feet high here. The children have a grand piano. Frank Lloyd Wright wanted to save on space. He didn't want this grand piano to take up too much space, so he actually built it into the wall, and the rest of the piano juts out over the stairwell as you're climbing up to this room. What I want to focus on, though, is the image on the left here. So I'm going to zoom in and give you a sense in terms of some of the really wonderful choices Frank Lloyd Wright has made to create a sense of intimacy and scale in this beautiful playroom. I should mention that occasionally after his kids went to bed, they could also use this room to entertain their guests. It's an elegant space, and it was a multi-purpose space in some ways. So I think it's really interesting that Frank Lloyd Wright, first of all, there's an emphasis on the fireplace, and we'll see that in virtually all of his domestic designs. He thinks of it as the heart of the home. It's where the family gathers. So the emphasis on the fireplace, and just above it, we have a mural that was painted by one of Wright's friends. It's a mural from the book Arabian Nights, and so we see the fisherman here with the genie kind of emerging from the lamp up above. But what's happening in terms of design, Frank Lloyd Wright is using these very long, flat Roman bricks in this design to emphasize the horizontality of this lower part of the room. So even though the ceiling is 15 feet high, when you walk into this space, there's a layer of architecture basically to make you feel grounded, to make you feel like you're in a space that's still intimate. Look at how low these window benches are. If you were a child, you could sit right there, look out the window, read a book, and almost feel like you're in a tree house. It's very intimate. It's a really wonderful consideration in terms of the size of the people that would be using this room. Now, a few other spaces very quickly in Frank Lloyd Wright's home in Oak Park, Illinois. We see this little ingle nook that was just inside from the front door. We see a couple of themes spilling over here. The emphasis on the fireplace as an important gathering space for homes at the end of the 19th century. We also see an emphasis on natural colors, an appreciation for colors from the natural world. So we've got a kind of sage green here, and then the wood and the bricks are, well, they're not painted. They are the materials in their natural form. And so he's letting the materials speak for themselves. So once again, we see these natural colors. Wright is known for his great pithy quotes, and he and his family had multiple quotes that sort of spoke to how they engaged with others and how they engaged with the world. So here we have truth is life. His family quote growing up was truth against the world. Good friend, around these hearthstones, speak no evil word of any creature. So a rounded arch, once again, reminding us of his mentor's building at the World's Columbian exhibition, but really an intimate space, natural materials, natural colors here. And so we'll wrap up with our look at his home with just one last room, and that is the dining room. Somehow this always reminds me of the movie Beetlejuice, because I think there's a famous dining room scene in that movie that also features these very high back chairs that make me feel like I should be sitting up a little bit straighter right now. So Frank Lloyd Wright does a lot of really wonderful, amazing things in this room. First of all, his attention to light. He is working to diffuse the light in this room to make it sort of a cozier, more intimate space. So he does that with the windows all around this room, but also with a skylight just above the table. Now, those high back chairs that we see that probably cause a little back pain just by looking at them also do something really wonderful in this space as well. They create the sense of a room within a room here. So there's a real intimacy as you gather around with people here. Now, Frank Lloyd Wright once joked that he himself had bruises, too many bruises from intimate encounters with his own furniture design. So he joked about sort of knowing that this didn't look very comfortable. But the aesthetic here and the thought process around it, I think I have an appreciation for. Now, from his home in Oak Park, Frank Lloyd Wright is launched into the first of a couple of different scandals in his life. In 1909, Frank Lloyd Wright leaves his wife. He runs off with with the wife of one of his clients, a woman by the name of Mamah Borthwick, and they settle in Spring Green, Wisconsin, in this house that Frank Lloyd Wright designs. It's called Taliesin, and Taliesin becomes sort of the heart of the Wright operation. It's the name that is so often associated with Frank Lloyd Wright because it's not just his home; it turns into sort of a grander, like I said, an operation. Now, Taliesin is Welsh for shining brow, and that basically refers to the fact that this house is up on the top sort of side of a hill, and almost like it's protruding from the forehead, really, of this particular hill here. Now, Wright encounters some financial hardships after this big scandal. There aren't as many wealthy clients who are knocking on his door looking for him to design a home because his reputation has been sullied. You couple that with the hardships of the Great Depression, and Frank Lloyd Wright is strapped for cash. So he does something really innovative, and he is a man who is innovative throughout his entire life, and that is he begins a school of architecture right here at his home in Taliesin. So we see him here surrounded by his male architecture students in the 1930s. Now, he was a very clever person. So not only was he teaching these young men the principles of architecture, how to draw, how to design, but he also wanted to instill the principles of engineering, of building. So he would have them working on projects around his house, free labor essentially, and keep them employed that way along the way. So a very smart one, this Frank Lloyd Wright. So this brings us to his best known design, Falling Water, also known as the Kaufman Residence from 1935. Now, if you've had the pleasure of visiting the site yourself, it is a place that stays with you. This is a home that was built as the weekend home for the owner of a Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania department store owner. It's located about 45 miles outside of Pittsburgh in rural southwestern Pennsylvania. Now, the Kaufmans, the family that commissioned this design, owned this property and were really in love with this little waterfall that we see here. They'd had a rustic cabin on the land really just across the way here that focused on this beautiful view of the waterfall. And so they commissioned Frank Lloyd Wright to create something that was more permanent and more significant, a place that they could retreat to from Pennsylvania. Now, Time magazine has called Falling Water Wright's most beautiful job, and it's been listed among the Smithsonian's 28 places to see before you die. The house has been designated a National Historic Landmark, and in 1991, the members of the American Institute of Architects named Falling Water the best all-time work of American architecture. So this is really one of the most celebrated structures in our entire country. We're going to spend a little time thinking about it, looking at it, and even going inside. I wanted to show you just one other view of this beautiful building from a different time of year, and just think about how it is connected to this landscape in such a wonderful way. A quick story in terms of the legend of how it was designed. Apparently, Kaufman commissioned the design of a house with Frank Lloyd Wright, and then didn't hear anything from his architect for 9 months. So one day he calls him up and he's like, I'm in Pennsylvania, but I'm going to drive over to you in Wisconsin, and I'm looking forward to seeing how the design is moving along. And at this point, Frank Lloyd Wright has not put anything on paper. He knows he's got a couple hours, so he sits down at a drafting desk, knowing that his client is on his way there. And with his students, his architecture students, huddled all around him, Frank Lloyd Wright shakes the design of Falling Water out of his sleeve and sort of dazzles Kaufman when he arrives at Taliesin. So what is the end result? The end result is this building that looks like it is in part a really sort of modern design. We see these red metal elements throughout, but we also see something that seems fully integrated with the natural environment. This stone structure that rises up out of the stone of the waterfall, and then these cantilevered elements, these terraces here that echo the shape of the waterfall itself. And when I say cantilevered, that means that there's no visual means of support here. That it just looks like it's sticking out and could essentially sort of fall over if it were not for some steel that's integrated into the design. So those terraces, like I said, they echo the plane of the waterfall here, but they also provide for these wonderful experiences outside, this engagement with the outdoors that Frank Lloyd Wright has always been really fond of in terms of his home designs. We'll see that again and again tonight. Now, I want to take you inside Falling Water because ever since I was first introduced to the interior of Falling Water through slides back when I was an undergrad, it is a place that has dazzled me. Now, what I want to prepare you for is that we are going to go into the main living area of Falling Water, which is here sort of sandwiched between these two terraces. And you'll notice that this is primarily a room with glass walls. This is a room that is meant to provide visual access to all of this greenery, to all of the trees and plants around in the forest. We don't quite see it in the pictures that I have. It's a little bit hard to see through those windows, but when we're inside, just remember that there are unparalleled, spectacular views of the outdoors while you're inside. So we're going to move inside, really kind of just over here to look at the fireplace of Falling Water, because as you remember, the fireplace is the heart of any Frank Lloyd Wright home. And I think here you see a lot of different Frank Lloyd Wright ideas kind of coming together in a wonderful way. So we've got this huge open fireplace. I'm sure if any of you have fireplaces in your homes right now, they're probably not this big or not this open. We have this really sort of interesting interplay between the natural world and the modern world. The hearth, look at the hearth. It's the natural stone outcropping seemingly here. That it seems as though this house is just resting on the earth, on the stone that existed there before. It is probably a major trip hazard, but it's beautiful. It's very evocative. It immediately makes this space feel like something that is special. its consideration for the outdoors here. Now, extending from that is the cut stone just above that. That's framing the fireplace itself. And then beyond that, you have these red metal elements that make it all seem so modern at the same time. Now, Frank Lloyd Wright imagined the family gathering around the fireplace, but he also imagined people cooking around this fireplace. Now, we think of like when we go away for the weekend, if we want to kind of rough it, I mean, isn't part of this, roasting a marshmallow or cooking a hot dog? Frank Lloyd Wright took it one step further, and this red spherical ball that we see over here with its own little niche in the wall, this is actually a pot for cooking stew. And so it's resting up here on these metal hinges so that you could swing it out and over this fireplace and cook your own food right over that fire. Now that is getting back to nature when you are on vacation. Now, the next image that I want to show you is a part of this big open kind of living room space at Falling Water. So what we're going to do is essentially turn like 90 degrees to the left right now. If we're facing noon, we are heading towards 9 o'clock. And here's what you see from that fireplace. We see a lot of low seating. We see a lot of big open glass panes here. And once again, this would have provided beautiful access to the outdoors. Over here are doors that lead out to one of those incredible terraces. Now, Frank Lloyd Wright loved this low furniture, perhaps because of what he saw at the World's Fair. We'll never know. He'd never admitted it. And he loved to use or integrate autumnal colors into his furniture designs. He also often recommended to his clients to use animal skins as throws throughout throughout the homes he designed. So again, another way to kind of connect the interior back to nature. Now you can imagine sitting in a room like this with that big open fire at the hearth, you would have that great sensation of sort of almost like being at camp. Imagine the smells there. Well, Frank Lloyd Wright takes it one step further. And what we're going to do is go through these doors over here on the left. Imagine opening these doors, going through them, and there is this glass case just beyond those doors. And what you can do is you can open them up at the bottom here and then push back the top of it. So it opens up like this, and you are then welcomed to a set of stairs that goes directly down into the water that then flows over the waterfall there. So the view is that staircase that goes right up into the living room. So imagine you're away from your house, you're at your weekend house, you're on vacation, you have the smell of the fire, you have the smell of nature, of the outdoors, and then you open up this little glass case in your living room and you can hear the water, you can smell the water. If you're a little warm, you can walk down the staircase and just dip your toes into that water. The way he imagined his clients connecting with this beautiful landscape here is really just revolutionary. Now, I will say the Kaufmans were a little disappointed at first that they didn't have the view of the waterfall, but once they got a sense in terms of how Frank Lloyd Wright was integrating this little river and the waterfall into the design of their home, they were sold. And who wouldn't be, right? So with the time that we have remaining, what I want to do is take you from the woods of Pennsylvania to the wilds of New York City, 25 years later, to another iconic Frank Lloyd Wright design. And that is, of course, the Guggenheim Museum, which was completed in 1959. Now, you don't even have to have gone to New York City to know that this building looks really different from virtually everything else in New York City. It is, it's horizontal in its emphasis. It's not a skyscraper. It's not gray. It's not blocky. It's not chunky. Instead, it has these kind of elegant flowing lines and an emphasis on circular lines at that. So you can only imagine that it stuck out like a sore thumb when it was built, and it still sticks out today. So this is, of course, an art museum that was designed to exhibit modern and contemporary art. I'm sure many of you, if you've had the chance to go inside a Frank Lloyd Wright building, this is probably one of the buildings you've seen. So here you see the human scale related to this building. When you visit the Guggenheim Museum, you go in right underneath the sign here that says Solomon R. Guggenheim. You pay for your ticket and you come into this incredible open area. This inside is flooded with natural light from this giant skylight at the top of the building. And it illuminates these multiple stories. I think there's 5 or 6 of these stories that are filled with art. And it's a spiraling ramp that stretches up to that skylight up above. And so for many people, what they do is they head right over to this ramp and they start making their way up and observing, the different exhibitions, the different works on view, and heading up to the top of this building. Here's just an alternative view here from the top looking down. I think it's just really interesting to think, to acknowledge that Frank Lloyd Wright isn't working with a perfect circle or perfect oval here. He's providing all of this visual interest along the way too, with these bump outs that sort of correspond to this eye-shaped element, this little fountain here on the bottom floor. So interestingly, Frank Lloyd Wright has designed this museum to sort of make it easier on us, the audience, the visitors, when we're there, because the intention was not for us to walk up the ramp and then to wind our way upwards. The intention was for all of us to go visit this museum, take the elevator to the top, and then slowly meander down. If you're anything like me, an hour into any museum visit, I'm very aware of my feet aching. All of a sudden, my purse feels like it's 50 pounds, and I'm physically uncomfortable. It's hard to be on your feet just looking for a long time. And so Frank Lloyd Wright was aware of that, and he wanted to add a little bit of momentum to your journey in this museum, so that as you're moving through the space, you're moving downhill, making it just a little bit more easier. Now, with the Guggenheim design, there are pros and cons, certainly. One of the pros is that as you move through that spiral, you engage with works up close, and then you see them again, sort of from far away, as you're on the other side of that spiral, giving you a new sense of perspective with those works. But the con is really the challenge of exhibiting art in a rounded wall, really. So you can see that these walls are divided into these niches, and curators can really only hang 1, 2, maybe 3 works of art together in these niches. There's certainly some constraints that come along with being a curator and exhibiting works at the Guggenheim. I'm not sure it would be their go-to design if they were able to sort of invent from nothing on their own. But he certainly is breaking boundaries, breaking barriers in terms of how people think of exhibiting works of art. And certainly it opened the floodgates for really innovative architects to design museums into the future. I'm thinking of other modern architects who create really dramatic sort of postmodern designs at institutions worldwide. All right, so let's turn our attention now back to domestic architecture and the fact that Frank Lloyd Wright had 3 primary different house designs over the course of this long career of his. Now, in any field that you're in, if you have one good idea, you're really lucky, right? I mean, one idea that people think, bravo, you've done something important here. In tech, you might come up with one great idea and that makes your career. In art, one great idea can once again make your career. But Frank Lloyd Wright was working for 70 years and he was continually productive, continually innovative. So let's take a look at these three very different house ideas. His earliest house design was called the prairie style. And these tend to be larger homes, sometimes palatial in scale. This is the Ward Willets house in Highland Park, Illinois. It dates to 1901. And the prairie house is a house that typically has these long, low lines that relate to the lines of the prairie itself. Here we can see a house that has these expansive terraces. It has a porte cochere. It has a mysterious hidden front door. We don't exactly see how we can access this house from the road. Sort of like that Japanese pavilion at the World's Fair. It has these low overhanging eaves to create this wonderful sense of privacy and shade inside the house. So these prairie style houses were generally made for wealthier clients. And then around the 1920s, Frank Lloyd Wright has a series of commissions. I should mention that a lot of the prairie style houses were made for clients in the Midwest. Makes sense with the name Prairie House, right? In the 1920s, Frank Lloyd Wright gets a series of commissions in California, and thus the innovation of his so-called textile block houses. Now, these are concrete blocks that he called textile blocks because there was an imprinted pattern on them. They were they had this added element, this added decorative element to them, and the designs themselves often look like Aztec temples in some way. There's something that looks timeless about them, but also something that looks eternally modern at the same time. This is the Ennis House in Los Angeles, California. It was designed in 1923. It's been featured in over a dozen movies, including Blade Runner. So people have been continually drawn to this house as a modern form, as a temple of modernism in some ways. Now, all of this brings us to his last his last house design, and the one that's really closest to my heart. This is the Usonian style, and this is a house design type that was born out of the Great Depression. Frank Lloyd Wright is struggling. There aren't a lot of rich people coming to him to design their grand dream homes. And instead, he realizes that he has to design a house that is within the financial reach of the average American. So he's designing on a middle class scale, or in some cases, maybe even a working class scale. This is the first Usonian style house. This is the Jacobs House, designed in 1936, so just a year after falling water. And this is in Madison, Wisconsin. So I'm going to zoom in on the Jacobs House for a moment. And I want to just touch on this name Usonian. What does it mean? Why would Frank Lloyd Wright call it Usonian? You might have some associations right off the bat. When I hear Usonian, I think utopian or utilitarian. And there's a little bit of that in the mix here. But for Frank Lloyd Wright, the word Usonian was sort of like US of A. It was a synonym for America, essentially. So this was an American house design for the average American. Now, this was not meant to be palatial. Frank Lloyd Wright said a modest house, this Usonian house, a dwelling place that has no feeling at all for the grand, except as the house extends itself in the flat parallel to the ground. It will be a companion to the horizon. So when we look at the Jacobs House here, we can see that the facade that faces the street is incredibly private. You can barely make out that there are any windows beyond these 4 square blocks right here, although there is a series of clerestory windows up above. But there's so much shade from this flat roof here, it's hard to see them. This looks like a blockade or something, something that is preventing you from even accessing it. Because once again, where is the front door? Frank Lloyd Wright is not welcoming you into this house. He is providing privacy for the owners here. Along with that, you might have noticed that there's a carport. This is a great way to save money in a design for a middle class home. But Frank Lloyd Wright also disdained garages. He said, Cars are not horses. They don't need stables. So a carport, it perfectly suffices. So we see a modestly scaled home that is that's facing its back essentially to the street. So what happens when we go to the other side of the Jacobs house, when we go into the garden area? Here is what we see. We see a house whose walls dissolve essentially into glass, so that when you're sitting inside the Jacobs house, you forget about the road, you forget about other people behind you, and you are oriented towards your backyard, your oasis. If you can't, Frank Lloyd Wright thought, if I can't get you out into the woods, I'll make you feel like you're at your own personal retreat. I'll make your backyard feel like your oasis. So like I said, he makes so much of the back of these houses into glass, and he prioritizes that primary living space. So here's the inside of the Jacobs house. It's been updated with some furniture that wasn't designed by Wright, but typically with these Usonian houses, with a fairly small price tag, you would get everything. You would get the home and the interior furnishings, which were very often built-ins. So we had a fully integrated idea of how you would live in these houses. With this image, you can see those high clerestory windows that would have been facing the street. You can see the suggestion of the huge wall of windows on the other side, and how the furnishings even now are oriented towards that garden. Now, there are a few things that we'll see as we get to the Zimmerman house. This reverse board and batten construction on the ceiling. These days, we love beautiful hardwood floors, don't we? But Frank Lloyd Wright put the beautiful wood on the ceiling, and instead he put concrete on the floor, and he put radiant heating underneath it. So he always said, I think it was like cool hands, warm heart, something like that. Cool feet, warm heart. So it's this idea that in the summer, the concrete would be really nice and cool, and then that radiant heat would warm it up and keep you super toasty during the winter months. So it was a really nice consideration for his clients who were, working on a budget. So all of this leads us to the incredible Zimmerman house in Manchester, New Hampshire. Now, I should have mentioned that the Jacobs house that we just saw, this original Usonian house was sold for about $5,000 at the time, which roughly is equivalent to about $80,000 to $100,000 in today's money. So it was still a fairly good bargain, considering you're getting all your furniture with this house along the way. Now, when we get to the Zimmerman house, which was designed in 1950 and done in 1952, it's a post-war house. And Frank Lloyd Wright's post-World War II clients had a little bit more money. They had a little bit larger properties. So you tend to get a few more of the bells and whistles. And of course, with the Zimmerman house, what you get with this property is a home that is owned by a single owner, with the intention of making this property a teaching tool. The Zimmermans live in this home very lightly until their deaths in 1988. And at that point, the house is bequeathed to the Currier Museum of Art, and it has been sort of immaculately preserved since then. So it's a real standout property for that reason. Now, let me briefly introduce you to the Zimmermans. We see them here in the photograph on the right, on the left, and we see their home, the original home that they had in Manchester, New Hampshire, on the right. They lived in a 13-room colonial. Now, they were a professional couple without children. He was a doctor. She was a surgical nurse that worked in his practice. And you get the sense from their letters to Frank Lloyd Wright that this home that they had was just really not working for them. You can see there's no yard to it, and there was so much house. So what they ended up doing was going to the local public library, to the Manchester City Library, and they found a book on Frank Lloyd Wright's architecture. Really, it was on his philosophies. It didn't even have any images of his designs in it. And they were so moved by what he wrote about that they wrote to him. And they said, We wish to build a small, simple house that would require the least possible housekeeping and which would allow for privacy and outdoor living. Certainly not what they were getting over here on the right. So in many ways, they were the perfect clients. They were eager to work with this celebrated architect, and they were willing to subscribe to his philosophy of living because there's a certain kind of way you have to live in these houses. They even said, we are willing to make all the necessary financial sacrifices to make this the most comfortable and convenient home for us as it promises to be the most beautiful. So of course, Frank Lloyd Wright says, come on out to Taliesin and we'll talk about building your house. So Frank Lloyd Wright never comes to New Hampshire, but he sees the site plan. He gets very familiar with the area where the house will be built. And in the end, he sends one of his apprentices from the Taliesin Fellowship, from his architectural school, a young man by the name of John Geiger, who's about 30 years old when he comes out to New Hampshire. Now, Mrs. Zimmerman, who becomes a full Frank Lloyd Wright devotee in this process, gives him multiple invitations to come to the site, to come to the house after it's finished. He never gets closer than Massachusetts, but he does write to her and he says, Mrs. Zimmerman, I know your house from A to Z. Nice little play on their last name. But basically says, I designed it. I know it. I almost don't even need to go there. This is the house in progress. This young man, John Geiger, essentially becomes like the construction foreman. He understands Wright's unusual plans, and he makes sure that this house is built to Frank Lloyd Wright's specifications. And he is also kind of the person that makes a lot of the last minute decisions. And he ensures that like any big changes are approved by Wright. Now, just after this house was built, here is a view of it. It looks a little bit different today. A lot of those birch trees are gone. But what did the Zimmermans get out of this design from Frank Lloyd Wright? Of course, they got a house with furnishings in total. It's a 2-bedroom, two bathroom house, and it's about 1,800 square feet. So in Manchester, that's roughly the size of like most of the condos in the area. At the time, they paid $36 for the house. And in the end, well, that was the original quote, I should say. In the end, it came out closer to about $60,000, which was about 3 times more than the average house in the area. In today's money, it probably would have been worth about $500,000. With this crazy real estate market that we have today, it's probably more than $1 million. But at this point, it's priceless because it's a work of art that has been immaculately preserved. So what do you get for, well, what did the Zimmermans get for their $60,000? They got a house with no basement, no attic, and no garage. Now, if you're a homeowner, think for a moment about what you put in those places. Is it anything necessary to the way you live day in and day out? Frank Lloyd Wright would say, no, you don't need it. So you had to really subscribe to his philosophy of living, to this minimalist aesthetic, really, in order to move into this house. But he also designed them a house that does not have a single step in it. It is a house that they could grow old in together. It's a house that sort of took care of them in the same way that they took care of it. It had very low maintenance. There's not a single surface in this house that you have to paint. So in terms of maintaining this house, it was a gift. And like I said, it's been so beautifully preserved that you really get a great understanding of how that works when you visit it. Now, if we look at it from above, they have a rectangular plot of land here, and you can see the other houses in the neighborhood face the street. Frank Lloyd Wright decided to place this house at a diagonal, creating a very private backyard, because one of these streets that it's on is on a fairly major, a fairly busy street here. So you get this very private triangular backyard here. And then in the front yard, you have this really kind of interesting thing that Frank Lloyd Wright does. He creates this very narrow space for you to kind of squeeze through this driveway that then opens up into this like car park when you come into the property. So this idea of compression and release is one that you'll experience again once you go inside the house. He is taking advantage of passive solar energy here, and he is being really mindful of the lay of the land. We'll get a sense of that as we move through the program. Now, when you when you get your Frank Lloyd Wright designed house, here is the home looking pretty naked. It's before all of the mature landscapes that we're familiar with today are there, but you do get even your own Frank Lloyd Wright designed mailbox, as you see here. It's got to be the best mailbox in all of Manchester. And it's a little preview for what you're going to see at the house. It's all the same materials. It's the wood, the glass, the concrete, and the brick here. And I mean, wouldn't this just make getting your mail every day an absolute delight? So it sort of sets the stage when you come in. You go through this little narrow passageway, you get to the open car park here, and then you see this long, low house. And sort of like that first Usonian house that we saw before, it's a very private facade. These are all windows in these cast concrete blocks up here. And this is the front door, sort of like those prairie style houses that he was designing almost a half century earlier. He doesn't call a lot of attention to the front door. You could almost miss it. But also, like his earlier designs, even like Falling Water, he's interested in the topography of this landscape. And the Zimmermans had this big boulder right here, almost at the center of the property. And so Frank Lloyd Wright uses that as a way to mark the front door. It's a nice sort of relationship between the natural world and the house that he designs. Now, where we are going to go from here, before we go right in, I'm going to bring you over here to the carport. I should mention that this element over here is just like a little storage shed for the Zimmermans. They got a little bit of storage out of Frank Lloyd Wright. But when you come home, let's imagine you're the Zimmermans, you'd come and park your car right here. And Frank Lloyd Wright provides this little view into the backyard. It's like a letterbox view. And what happens here is that it frames up the beautiful nature in this backyard. And it's absolutely gorgeous on a sunny day, on a snowy day, on a rainy day. And it's a space that I swear to God, just it lowers your heart rate. It calms you down. It's so peaceful. It's so beautiful. Frank Lloyd Wright is creating like a rustic retreat in some ways for his clients here. Think about what you see when you park your car when you go home. Are you in a messy garage? Are you, facing your neighbors? Frank Lloyd Wright is giving you privacy, and he's connecting you with nature here. He's also introducing the key elements of the house, the key materials in the house. So here's just another view into that backyard, a better sense of that greenery there. Sorry. And at this point, at this area of the house, the whole structure of the house is kind of built into the landscape. So as you're looking at the backyard through the carport, the land just beyond this little wall here is roughly at chest height. So you really feel connected to it. So then you make your way along this little walkway, appreciating the wood up above, the concrete blocks over here, and you get to this sort of semi-private glass door, the front door here. As you make your way in, you actually hit a brick wall. We're looking at a plan here, and it is intentionally upside down to keep us oriented to the same way we've been experiencing the house so far. So here is the carport. Here's that little walkway to the front entrance. You come in, there is that brick wall that you run into, and then you're going to get another sense of compression and then release into the grandest space of this little house. What we would call the living room, Frank Lloyd Wright called the garden room, and we will see why very quickly. This is his garden room, could also be called a music room. There's so many wonderful relationships with music here. He has created essentially a little bump out in this room just for the Zimmerman's grand piano. The Zimmermans played music. They shared a passion for music with Frank Lloyd Wright. He designed them this music stand. It's one of, I think, of about only 5 in the world. And then in this space, you can see there's a wooden ceiling, once again, sort of like with the Jacobs house. That's the reverse board and batten construction. It makes the interior of this house almost feel like you're inside a musical instrument. But what always catches my eye is this very long, very uncomfortable seeming bench couch seating here over here on the right, with these huge cushions on the back. The scale of them always seemed really odd to me until I understood the geometries of the house. So imagine for a moment sitting down over here on this bench seating, and this is what you'll be looking at. Frank Lloyd Wright dissolves the walls of this house into glass, and instead of putting art on the walls, he is framing up the nature in the backyard. You don't need paintings when you can look outside and connect with nature. And he emphasizes that connection by having these little wells for planting inside the house that dissolve perfectly with the gardens outside. In addition to that, he translates these brick piers into tree trunks, and look at how he dissipates the light coming in between them to make it look as though it's the light filtering down from through the leaves of trees. So he's really creating, well, he's bringing the outdoors in and the indoors out. Notice how the wooden ceiling here extends beautifully, seamlessly outside. That pane of glass is really our only separation here. So this connection with the outdoors is second to none, really, in the Zimmerman house. I want to go back to this image just for one more moment, just to emphasize beyond the garden connections here, beyond the connections to the natural world. Frank Lloyd Wright has really kind of playful things with geometry and the connection to music. So bear with me for a moment. There's a basic shape that is integrated throughout this house, and it is a roughly 4 foot by 4 foot square. We see it in the couch cushions over here. It's actually scored into the floor as well. 4 foot by 4 foot squares. We saw it with the windows that the couch faces, and then we see it broken down into these concrete blocks just above these cushions. Above each cushion is a 2 foot by 2 foot concrete block. There's 2 of them. And then inside them is a 1 foot by 1 foot pane of glass. And as we think of this as a house that's made for music, you can imagine this as a whole note, a half note, and a quarter note, kind of organizing our sense of this space here. Really wonderful, just fascinating. So we're going to move from our view into the garden room to looking back through the garden room. So this is, though, you're standing right by that music stand that Wright designed. Looking back through, this is the front door back here. And this is, of course, the fireplace that Frank Lloyd Wright would have wanted us all to gather around. Notice here he's playing with a little bit of engineering, a little bit of architectural virtuosity by having one edge of this fireplace be unsupported. He even includes a broken lintel at the bottom, as if to say, the history of architecture doesn't even apply here. I can do magical things with my designs. And the Zimmermans, just as Wright would have expected, spent a lot of time around that fireplace. I'm not sure they ever cooked in it like at Falling Water, but they certainly liked to read and to entertain around it. Now we're going to move from the garden room here into this next space, which most of us would call our dining room. Frank Lloyd Wright called it his dining loggia. So we're looking at the Zimmerman's very modestly sized dining room table. You can just see the edge of that same table here. It's in essentially a walkway, a pass-through that is lined on one side with these glass doors that can be opened up and really left open through most of the year because there are screens on the inside. Now, if you're anything like me, if you have a formal dining room, you don't use it. You hardly ever use it. Maybe you throw your mail there. Frank Lloyd Wright wanted to create a dining area for this couple that they could use all the time. And if they needed to entertain more people, this was a really flexible space that could work in other ways. In fact, all of the furniture, it was easily moved around and integrated with each other because it was all created on the same scale. All of the seating is roughly 13 inches off the ground, and all of the tables are roughly double that, 26 inches off the ground. So you could take this dining room table, move it back into, oh, sorry, I went the wrong way. Move it back into your garden room, put it between these two tables over here, and have this expansive dining room table with seating for people on this couch over here, with ottomans and other cushions for people on the other side. Easily seat up to 12. I love this image with some of the docents at docent training, because it gives you a sense in terms of how many people could squeeze into this, rather modestly sized house. Now, in the dining loggia, you also get an introduction to another grid system that takes place in the Zimmerman house, in addition to the 13 inches and the 26 inches in the furniture. That extends through the architecture as well. We see it in the board and batten construction. The boards were about 10 inches. The batten was about 3, so 13 again. The shelves are about 10 inches from each other with a 3-inch shelf, 13 inches again. So there's this visual harmony throughout the house. These shelves blend into the shelves that lead us in to the kitchen. And so it creates a sense of peace, of ease, of flexibility in this house that you don't see in most houses that are designed today. So let's head into the kitchen. Frank Lloyd Wright called it the workspace. It's a very narrow galley kitchen. We won't spend much time there. In addition to having all of your modern appliances, you also have your washer and dryer in this space as well. And the Zimmermans really wanted a big chest freezer too. So there are some clerestory windows up here, but you're basically at the center of the house, and in a space where, well, in today's world where we all like to gather in the kitchen, this is not the house for it. If you walk through the end of this room and take a left through this door, that leads you to the Zimmerman's guest bedroom with these 2 twin beds here, a little desk that also functions as a sewing space for Mrs. Zimmerman, a nice set of windows that kind of wrap around this corner. This is that corner window here. You can see it's unsupported. These are mitered glass corners, and a corner that seems to extend through this Japanese screen that Frank Lloyd Wright certainly would have approved of. This room also has some great storage that the Zimmermans lobbied hard for. In a house with no basement and no attic, you need a little bit of good storage. So now let's turn our attention to the master bedroom. Whenever I said this on tours, people were inevitably really disappointed by their master bedroom because it's very small in scale. The Zimmermans slept on just a full-size bed through the remainder of their lives, through the remainder of their marriage. They also used the same bedspread for the next 30 plus years, which I always find really remarkable, but it's the same material that we see throughout the house. Now we get a good sense of that scored concrete floor here with the radiant heating system that was integrated into it. When you go to sleep at night, you look up at the beautiful wooden ceiling, and you can see this is just the edge of their bed here, and the view of the backyard, and that view of that wooden ceiling that blends seamlessly through the glass partition here to the eaves outside. It's another great way to bring the outside in and the inside out. Now, and that's just a view of the beautiful construction of the ceiling above their bed. So here is the view of the Zimmerman's master bedroom from the backyard. You can once again sort of see how the house is built in to this rising slope of the backyard. But as we go all the way to the far end of the backyard, we can see how Frank Lloyd Wright has once again dissolved the walls of this house so that they're primarily glass, and that the Zimmermans could access this beautiful backyard space that they had all year long, to really feel like they were in a retreat, to really feel like they're connected to nature and protected from the outside world. What a gorgeous home when you look at it, particularly at this time of the year. So at the far end of the Zimmerman's property are their ashes and a little monument that was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright's son-in-law and apprentice. And it says, there's a little quote here that says, beautify your own life and you beautify the lives of everyone around you. And it's a great testament to the Zimmermans and their intention to always have this house be a sort of an opportunity for teaching and for education. They always intended it to share it with the public. And so I think that quote really speaks to their great efforts to preserve their home and share it. So I know we're going a little bit late now, but I just wanted to very quickly show you that there is another Frank Lloyd Wright designed house in the neighborhood, just 3 houses down. It's another Usonian house. It's called the Usonian Automatic, the Khalil House, designed just a few years after the Zimmerman house by medical colleagues of Dr. Zimmerman. It's called the Usonian Automatic because essentially you build it. That's what makes it automatic. So it's designed with these concrete blocks. There's a unfinished in-law apartment in the backyard, but this house is just a little bit smaller than the Zimmerman house. It oftentimes people use the word bunker to describe it, but when it's lit up at dusk, or you can really see that it also has this wonderful lantern effect here. Inside, there's a lot of the same elements that you see at the Zimmerman house, with the scored concrete floor, the radiant heating, the low seating, and the autumnal colors. It's designed for a couple, and so it's intimate in terms of its scale. Here is the kitchen and the master bedroom, and just a quick view at how the in-law suite was staged shortly before it was purchased by the Courier Museum just a year or 2 ago. So we have something pretty spectacular in Manchester, New Hampshire, in that we have 2 Wright sites that are open to the public. And once again, if you're interested in visiting them, just go to the Courier Museum of Art's website and you can book those tours. They are up and running today. I know they stop them during the winter months. So in terms of Wright's legacy today, there are, a silver lining from COVID, I think there are 17 different Wright sites that have 3D tours that you can go on online, including Falling Water. So you can get the feeling of walking through that spectacular building. Now, in addition to that, there are dozens of Frank Lloyd Wright sites that are open to the public today, 72 to be precise. And these are all houses that have been, or buildings that are in kind of various stages of preservation. So when you go to the Zimmerman house, you get spoiled. You get the sort of the royal treatment in terms of a house that's been kind of perfectly preserved. When I first put this program together, I did a quick review in terms of how many Wright sites were for sale. There's always usually a few, and they can range anywhere from about $200,000 to $10 million. But the Wright community is an intense and passionate community. So if you ever wanted to buy your own Wright site, the expectation is that you would preserve it for all time. There is renewed interest in Frank Lloyd Wright due to books like Loving Frank and Devil in the White City. I think people are always interested in his very scandalous life and all of the adversity and the successes that marked his incredible career. So I would say his legacy is very strong today. There's always interest in his work. But just in recognition of the time here, I will end for now, and I welcome any questions or comments that you might have about Frank Lloyd Wright or the Zimmerman house. And I'll start looking at the chat as well. Wow, I see we have people here from Texas. Cheryl, thank you for joining us. Rivers has asked, I always wondered how the problem of the river dislocated the foundation of that wonderful house. Going back to the falling water. Yes, houses and water generally do not mix. And so even those cantilevered terraces began to wilt after a certain amount of time. There was a theory out there for some time that's essentially said that Frank Lloyd Wright really didn't design his houses to outlast their owners. So preserving these houses especially so in the case of falling water, is a massive undertaking. Oh, I'm so glad somebody from Scotland is here as well. Vancouver, Canada. This is so cool. Kansas City. There's a Frank Lloyd Wright in South Bend, Indiana. It was on the same street that we lived on. So you probably had a nice up close and personal take on that particular house, Cheryl. I'm glad you shared that. In Tulsa, Oklahoma. Oh, it's so nice to see that so many people found their way to us tonight. The idea of the built-in piano here, I can see Susan appreciating the economy of space there, maybe ducking underneath that piano. Let's see here. Oh, the very quick view of the Zimmerman's kitchen there that was filled with all those nostalgic things from the 1950s and 60s. I think it really does take a lot of people back when they see the images or see it in person on the tours too. All right, here. Thanks for the kind words people have shared. Oh, somebody's asking about the flatware at the Zimmerman house, and that is called Heathware. It's from Edith Heath, who was working out of, I believe it was Sausalito, California. I think you can still buy Heathware today. This is something that Mrs. Zimmerman would have sought approval for. She was very interested in getting like all the right things for her house. I mentioned briefly before that Frank Lloyd Wright sometimes designed clothes for his clients to wear inside of his spaces. I think if he would have been willing to do that for Mrs. Zimmerman, she would have gone all in. She at one point even wrote to him for special plans for a tablecloth for her dining room table. So, I mean, she wanted everything to be just to his specifications. So, so that's really the way they lived. But the Heathware was really different from what most people had at the time. It was, I mean, earthy is probably the right word for it. Sorry to fly back here, but you can see it on the table here. Most people had like bone china at this time. So this would have been something really different from what most people had in the 1950s. Let me keep going through some of these questions. Diane says, did Taliesin East totally burn? I don't think it totally burned, and whatever part did burn was rebuilt, because you can still go to Taliesin East today and see it. I mean, it doesn't look like it ever burned down. So that was Frank Lloyd Wright's home. That was and I'm sorry I'm a little fuzzy on some of the details of that particular scandal on his life, but he had somebody who was working on that property who essentially locked Wright's wife and other people inside the house, set it on fire, and also went through the house attacking them, murdering several people in the house. So so part of that home did burn. It's called Taliesin East. Diane writes, so I should note that there's also a Taliesin West, because Frank Lloyd Wright built another home in Scottsdale, Arizona. So he would move his entire architectural school down to Arizona and then move them back every single year, basically to just take advantage of better weather. So fascinating stories around that house and the house in Arizona. Oh, Wendy asked, I referred to reverse blank. It's called reverse board and batten construction. Let me see if these are good images to give you a sense of it. What was the second word and what does it mean? So we think of board and batten as sort of like, here you can see it with the ceiling. They're the boards that come together. These are all screwed into place. And it essentially means that there's a full board here, and then there's the smaller batten. The board is 10 inches, the batten is 3 inches. So that sort of creates this kind of foundational construction for all of the woodwork throughout the house. I hope that makes sense, Wendy. I hope I explained it well. Let's see here. I'm glad you asked about that though, because I know I flew through a lot of the big ideas here. Thank you for the kind words. Let's see. The one in Springfield, Ohio, they say the skylights leaked so bad from day one that it was like a downpour inside the house through the center of the stairs. Well, I'm glad you mentioned that. Frank Lloyd Wright has a real shoddy reputation when it comes to the quality of his roofs. Like I said, maybe these houses were not designed to outlive their owners, but it seems like even original owners might have encountered some real problems there. The Zimmermans had to replace their roof during their lifetime. I mean, they lived there 30 plus years. A lot of people have to do that. But the museum actually restored the roof to Wright's original specifications. So I'm not sure how much water damage the Zimmermans had, but I've heard that more than one Frank Lloyd Wright property had some difficulties with the roof lines. Oh, Susan added some info about the burning of Taliesin. Thank you for adding that in, Susan. I appreciate it. T.A. Riley says it almost feels like being on a wooden boat. Oh, that's actually a really apt comparison. There's a lot of people that visit the house and sort of say that they feel like they're almost, because it is such a long, narrow house, people have compared it to the feeling of being on a camper sometimes even, or a boat. That's wonderful. Yeah. All right. I think I got through most of these questions. If anybody has anything else, no, we've gone a little bit late, but we're sort of an intimately sized group. If you have anything else, please feel free to reach out to me through my website, which is iamculturallycurious.com. I'm always happy to hear from people, whether it's a fact check or a lingering question even after the fact. So thank you again, everybody, for sticking around tonight for learning more about Wright and this particular house. And thanks for sharing your evening with me.
Thank you, Jane, so much for being here. And thank you for that wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed it, especially the house, the Falling Waters house. I just imagine I have experienced some really nice nights in like a kind of Three Seasons porch when it's raining. And I can imagine that it must be just as nice, well, much nicer, obviously, in that house. So thank you again for sharing all of those houses with us. I have put a link to a survey in the chat. If anyone attending wouldn't mind clicking on that link and taking a few minutes to take the survey, we greatly appreciate your feedback. And I hope you all have a great night. You can expect a link to the recording of this program in a couple days, where if you wanted to share it or if you missed part of it, you could rewatch it and experience the whole presentation. And thank you again so much. Have a great night.
Good night, everyone. Take care.